In a world oversaturated with fleeting viral stars and talent show hopefuls, one boy dared to do more than just sing. He made the nation feel. His name is Malakai Bayoh, a soft-spoken 13-year-old from South London whose voice sent shockwaves through the entertainment world during his breathtaking appearance on Britain's Got Talent. But behind the soaring notes and glowing reviews lies a story far more profound and emotionally charged than what viewers saw on their screens. On the surface, Malakai was just another young hopeful stepping onto a stage that has launched dozens of careers. Yet what unfolded was anything but ordinary. What many didn't see was the emotional burden this young artist carried, the loss he endured in silence, and the unwavering determination that fueled every note he sang. Born to immigrant parents from Sierra Leone, Malakai's journey to stardom began not in a studio, but in the modest corners of a London household filled with music, love, and dreams too big for their circumstances. It was here that his passion for music was born, nurtured by his family's rich cultural heritage and his grandmother's ever-present encouragement. But when Malakai stepped into the national spotlight, the stakes were no longer just about winning a competition. They were about holding it together when everything was threatening to fall apart. As we peel back the layers of this remarkable journey, one thing becomes clear. Malakai Bayoh didn't just perform for an audience. He performed through pain, turning his deepest grief into the very fuel that carried his voice to global recognition. This is the true story behind the golden buzzer moment, the viral ovations, and the quiet heartbreak that made Malakai's performance more than a song. It made it a statement. Long before the golden confetti and thunderous applause, Malakai Bayoh was simply a boy with a dream tucked into the heart of London, a city teeming with energy, chaos, and quiet opportunities waiting to be found. Born in 2010 to parents who had emigrated from Sierra Leone in search of a better life, Malakai's earliest days were shaped by hardship, but also by an unshakable sense of hope. His family lived modestly, navigating life in a working-class neighborhood where every day brought new challenges, but where love, discipline, and the echo of music always filled the air. His mother, a woman of resilience and quiet strength, carried with her a deep love for music, classical pieces, gospel hymns, West African rhythms, and passed this passion on to her son. There was no grand piano in their home, no formal studio or high-end microphone, just a boy, a radio, and a voice he barely understood yet. It was his grandmother, too, who played a key role in his upbringing, often humming lullabies from back home and reminding Malakai that music wasn't just for entertainment. It was a way of speaking when words failed. By the age of 7, Malakai was already standing out not for being the loudest, but for being the one whose voice could quiet a room. That voice found its first real stage at St. George's Church in South London, where, thanks to his mother's encouragement, he joined the children's choir. It wasn't just a place of worship, it became a training ground for discipline, for emotional expression, and for pushing through fear. Under the guidance of conductor Scott Price, Malakai didn't just learn pitch and posture. He learned how to channel emotion, how to listen, how to lead without speaking. The church, with its stone walls and stained glass windows, became the backdrop of his quiet transformation from an ordinary kid to an extraordinary vocal talent. And though London was loud and life was never easy, Malakai's small voice started to rise above the noise, carried not just by natural talent, but by years of quiet perseverance and a home built on dreams larger than their circumstances. It didn't take long for Malakai Bayoh's voice to stop being just a family treasure and become something that commanded attention well beyond the four walls of his South London home. At just 7 years old, his mother signed him up for the children's choir at St. George's Church, a decision that would quietly shift the course of his life. What began as a simple attempt to build confidence and find community became the foundation of something extraordinary. Under the sharp yet compassionate guidance of conductor Scott Price, Malakai was introduced to the complexities of vocal control, breath support, and musical storytelling. The choir was no casual affair, it was disciplined, demanding, and filled with children far older than him. Yet Malakai stood out, not because he tried to outshine anyone, but because his tone carried a haunting purity that caught people off guard. In a room full of voices, his was the one you remembered. He learned how to harmonize, how to breathe with intention, and more importantly, how to pour genuine emotion into lyrics that weren't written for someone his age. Every rehearsal became a lesson in focus, and every performance a small test of courage. While most kids his age were still struggling to memorize lines for school plays, Malakai was already delivering notes with precision and passion far beyond his years. His mentors began to take notice, recognizing not just raw talent, but an emotional sensitivity that could not be taught. He wasn't just singing, he was translating feeling into melody, grief into grace. And it wasn't only about voice, it was about poise, humility, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you were born to do something rare. Slowly, within the echoing walls of the church and the soft encouragement of his teachers, Malakai's identity began to take shape, not as a prodigy groomed for fame, but as a child deeply in tune with the emotional weight of music. And though he didn't know it yet, every note he sang in that sacred space was preparing him for a much larger audience, one that would soon be watching with tears in their eyes and jaws on the floor. Sometimes, all it takes is one performance to change the course of a life, and for Malakai Bayoh, that moment came unexpectedly during a modest school Christmas event. At just 9 years old, he was chosen to perform a solo rendition of "Oh Holy Night," a song known for its emotional power and technical difficulty. There was no elaborate stage, no polished production, just a boy, a microphone, and a room filled with classmates, teachers, and a few proud parents. But what happened next would mark the first major turning point in Malakai's journey. As he sang, his voice filled the room with a kind of stillness that only true emotion can create. The high notes soared effortlessly, the phrasing was mature, and there was a purity to his tone that left people stunned. Several attendees captured the moment on their phones, and within hours, clips began to circulate online. What started as a heartfelt school performance soon exploded into a viral sensation. The video racked up thousands and millions of views, drawing attention from blogs, music teachers, and even talent scouts. It wasn't just the clarity of his voice that resonated, it was the way he delivered each line with the conviction of someone who had lived the emotions behind the lyrics. Social media lit up with praise, describing Malakai as a once-in-a-generation voice and a soul far beyond his years. For Malakai and his family, the response was overwhelming but deeply affirming. They had always known he had something special, but now the world seemed to agree. The praise was accompanied by an outpouring of encouragement, including messages from music professionals urging his family to take the next step. That single performance, captured in grainy smartphone footage, became the catalyst for everything that followed. More than just a viral moment, it was a glimpse into what Malakai was capable of. For the first time, the idea of a professional singing career wasn't just a fantasy whispered in his bedroom. It was a possibility being shouted from screens around the world. Encouraged by the momentum, his family made a decision that would shape the next chapter of his life. Malakai would audition for Britain's Got Talent. And while the stakes were high and the pressure was building, Malakai's eyes were no longer just on the stage. They were on something far bigger, a chance to turn his passion into a purpose. The stage was massive, the lights unforgiving, and the pressure almost unbearable. But on that fateful day in 2022, Malakai Bayoh stepped out onto Britain's Got Talent with a kind of composure that belied his 13 years. With his mother and sister standing nervously in the wings, Malakai took center stage before millions watching at home and a live audience whose silence hung thick with anticipation. Before him sat the four formidable judges: Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, Alicia Dixon, and Bruno Tonioli. Individuals known as much for their discerning critiques as their occasional bursts of astonishment. Dressed simply, with hands slightly trembling and a calm intensity in his eyes, Malakai introduced himself. And then the first notes of Sarah Brightman's Pavin filled the theater. From the opening phrase, it was immediately clear that this was no ordinary child performance. His voice, rich and haunting, seemed to echo with layers of emotion far beyond his years. The audience froze, not in confusion, but in awe. There was no background track overpowering his sound, no flashy distractions, only a voice that felt raw, real, and piercingly beautiful. Malakai sang with a clarity that felt almost spiritual, his high notes delivered not with force, but with emotional precision that made people hold their breath. By the time the final note faded into the silence, the entire room erupted. The audience stood in waves, clapping, some crying, many cheering louder than they had all evening. The judges exchanged looks of disbelief, with even Simon Cowell, the show's most notorious skeptic, visibly moved. He leaned in and, in a rare moment of admiration, told Malakai that not only did he take a huge risk by choosing such a demanding piece, but he had executed it brilliantly. Amanda Holden followed with glowing remarks about, with the golden confetti barely swept off the stage and the nation still buzzing about his audition. Malakai Bayoh now faced a pressure unlike anything he had ever experienced. The expectations were immense. He wasn't just a contestant anymore. He had become the face of the season, the young prodigy with a voice too big for his age, and everyone wanted to see what he would do next. For his semi-final performance, Malakai made a bold choice that left even experienced musicians raising their eyebrows. He selected O mio, Babino Cara by Giacomo Puccini, an operatic aria revered for its emotional weight and technical difficulty. It was a song that demanded breath control, dynamic expression, and a powerful yet delicate delivery, challenges most adult singers struggle to master. Behind the scenes, Malakai threw himself into preparation. He trained relentlessly with professional vocal coaches, spending hours refining his resonance, breath management, and articulation. But this wasn't just about vocal precision. Malakai knew that connecting emotionally with the audience was just as important. To achieve that, he worked closely with a stage performance coach, learning how to embody the narrative behind the music, to make every movement and glance feel purposeful and real. His days were filled with rehearsals, and his nights were often spent reviewing recordings and working through notes with his team. The boy who once sang for fun was now immersed in a world where every detail mattered, and yet he carried it all with quiet determination. When the semi-final night finally arrived, the stakes were sky high. As Malakai stepped out onto the stage in a tailored suit, the lights dimmed and the theater hushed. He began the aria with breathtaking control, delivering each phrase with a vulnerability and intensity that gripped the room. There was no falter, no hesitation, only purity and passion. The crowd sat in stunned silence, not out of disinterest, but out of complete immersion in the performance. When he reached the aria's climax, his voice soared, and with it, the emotion poured out like a wave. The moment the music stopped, the audience erupted in a roar of applause and thunderous cheers. Alicia Dixon, visibly emotional, wiped away tears and said that Malakai didn't just perform a song. He made her feel every word as if it were her own story. The judges echoed her sentiments, commending not only his bravery, but his remarkable growth since the audition. And yet, beneath the celebration, there lingered an undeniable tension. For Malakai, this wasn't just a performance, it was a test, one he had passed with grace and brilliance. But what he didn't know was that the biggest emotional challenge of his life was just around the corner, waiting to shatter the world he had worked so hard to build. Just as Malakai Bayoh was reaching the peak of his rising stardom, a devastating turn of fate would forever change the course of his journey. It was the night before the Britain's Got Talent Grand Final, and while the world expected a celebratory atmosphere behind the scenes, Malakai was instead hit with the kind of news no child should have to process. His beloved grandmother had passed away. For most fans watching at home, the stage lights and applause disguised the weight he was carrying, but in reality, Malakai was walking into the most important performance of his life with a heart freshly shattered. His grandmother had been more than just family. She was a source of inspiration, his biggest supporter, and the one who had stood by him from the very beginning. She attended rehearsals, helped him warm up his voice, reminded him to stay humble, and gave him the courage to believe that his talent was meant for something greater. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and her death, so sudden and so close to the final, left him completely emotionally exposed. He received the news early that morning, cold, quiet, and final. There were no cameras capturing his reaction, no press releases announcing the heartbreak. It was just Malakai, alone in a quiet corner, trying to make sense of a world that had just lost one of its brightest lights. The show, however, would go on, and Malakai had to decide whether to push forward or retreat in his grief. In the end, it was the memory of his grandmother's voice, soft but firm, reminding him to never stop singing, that helped him stand tall. Supported by his mother, his vocal coaches, and the Britain's Got Talent crew who rallied quietly behind him, Malakai pulled himself together not because he had healed, but because he wanted to honor her. The grief had not disappeared, but it had taken new form, becoming the fire behind his voice, the ache behind every lyric. He didn't speak about the loss publicly before the performance. There were no sympathy interviews, no backstage sob stories, just a quiet boy with a storm inside him, ready to take the stage. What the audience would soon witness wasn't just a performance, it was a farewell, a tribute, and a transformation. This was no longer about winning a title. For Malakai, it was about giving everything he had left to the woman who gave him everything she had. And when he walked onto that stage under the spotlight one more time, the weight of grief followed him. But so did love, resilience, and a strength no one expected from someone so young. The night of the Britain's Got Talent Grand Final arrived with a weight that hung heavy in the air. Yet none felt it more than 13-year-old Malakai Bayoh, having just suffered the loss of his grandmother, the very heartbeat of his musical journey. He stood in the wings preparing to deliver a performance that would be more than just a bid for the crown. It would be a eulogy in melody, a final gift to the woman who believed in him when the world still hadn't noticed. As he stepped onto the stage, the energy shifted. Dressed in a sleek black suit and standing beneath the white-hot lights of the massive stage, Malakai looked less like a nervous child and more like a seasoned opera singer ready to etch a story into music history. The song he chose was no coincidence, Nessun Dorma, the legendary aria from Puccini's opera Turandot. The piece is known not just for its technical difficulty, but for its message of triumph through adversity. And on this night, that message could not have rung more true. From the first note, the theater was silent. His voice didn't just rise, it expanded, flowing into every corner of the auditorium with haunting precision and aching beauty. He held his notes with maturity far beyond his years, his phrasing laced with sorrow and power in equal measure. This wasn't just a performance, it was a testimony. Each crescendo carried the weight of personal loss, and each decrescendo whispered gratitude to the woman who had given him his voice. The camera panned across the audience to show viewers wiping away tears, some holding their breath as if afraid to disturb the sacred moment unfolding before them. And then came the final note, a soaring, spine-tingling declaration of resilience. It hung in the air for a split second before the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. People stood, clapped, and cried all at once. Even the judges, known for their polished composure, couldn't hide their emotions. Simon Cowell, never one to exaggerate, leaned forward and called it not just a beautiful performance, but a statement. A rare fusion of technical excellence and unfiltered emotion. Alicia Dixon's voice shook as she commended his growth and authenticity, while Amanda Holden, visibly moved, praised Malakai for singing with his soul. Bruno Tonioli called it world-class, and in that moment, no one could argue. It wasn't just that he sang better than anyone expected. It was that he made them feel something no one expected. With that performance, Malakai didn't just compete. He created a memory that would live in the hearts of millions. Whether or not he won the competition became irrelevant, because in that moment, he had already achieved what most artists only dream of. He turned grief into glory, silence into song, and pain into power. When the final curtain fell on Britain's Got Talent, Malakai Bayoh didn't just exit the stage as a finalist. He stepped into the world as a fully recognized artist. His name now whispered alongside some of the most iconic breakout stars the show had ever seen. But as the applause faded and the television cameras stopped rolling, Malakai's story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. While many contestants vanish into the background once the spotlight dims, Malakai did the opposite. He soared. Within days of the final airing, major record labels were knocking, and one in particular acted swiftly. Universal Music, seeing his rare combination of youth, skill, and emotional authenticity, signed him to a multi-record deal that would cement his place in the classical music world. That same fall, Malakai released his debut album titled Golden, an intentional tribute not only to the golden buzzer moment that changed everything, but also to the legacy of his grandmother, whose memory was woven into every note. The album, a daring blend of classical arias and contemporary ballads, showcased not just vocal range, but emotional depth that critics described as uncannily mature. More than just a collection of beautiful songs, Golden was a personal statement, one that resonated deeply with audiences and quickly shot to the top of the classical music charts. Collaborations with legendary composers like Sir Carl Jenkins and Andrew Lloyd Webber added gravitas to the project, and their endorsements of Malakai's artistry sent a clear message to the industry. This was no fleeting talent. As invitations poured in, Malakai made his debut at the Royal Albert Hall, performing selections from Golden with the prestigious symphony orchestra. His presence commanding, his voice filling the hall like it had done so many times before in smaller rooms with lower ceilings. The concert was broadcast live, drawing in millions of viewers and officially marking his arrival on the global stage. From there, he performed across Europe, gracing